Okay. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the inspection response addendum 35R and going into some drafting language. So let's take a look at the form 35R. When you take a look at the form 35R, think about this in three parts. The first part is going to be section 1, and that's how I refer to section 1, section 2, section 3. Section 1 is the buyer's request for repairs. This is the section where the buyer does their home inspection, and then after they do their home inspection, they can request repairs. They have the option to request repairs to be done to the property. Once the buyer puts in the request for the repairs, section 2 allows the seller to respond to those buyer requests. Okay. Section 3 is the buyer's response to the seller's response. So section 1, the buyer can request repairs. Section 2, the seller responds to those requests. In seller 3, the buyer responds to the seller's response. Okay. So let's take a dive into each one of these sections right now. Okay. Section 1, you have 4 choices. Okay. And let's take a look at all these 4 choices. The first choice, box 1 right here, is the buyer's inspection of the property is approved and the inspection contingency is satisfied. If you are a seller, that is the box that you're hoping to see when you get this form back. The buyer has waived their inspections. Everything looks honky-dory. Life is good. Okay. Option number 2, if the buyer checks it, you absolutely do not want to see this as a seller, but this is the buyer's inspection of the property, or buyer's inspection of the property is disapproved, and this agreement is terminated. The earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. So buyer has done their inspections. Based off of their inspections, they are terminating this agreement. Okay. The third choice that the buyers have is the buyer gives notice of additional inspections. The inspector's recommendation is attached. The time of the buyer's response to the initial and additional inspection is extended as provided by paragraph 5 of form 35. Okay, so this is how the buyer, if the buyer needs to do additional inspections, this is how they would do it. They would check off box 3, send this over to the seller along with that copy of the inspection report that says the inspector is recommending additional inspections or further inspections. And that will get the buyer an additional 5 days, if it wasn't changed, to do additional inspections. Okay. And then the last box is the buyer requests the following modifications and or repairs described below or on the attached pages. If the seller agrees to these modifications or repairs, the inspection contingency shall be deemed satisfied. Note, if the buyer provides any portion of the inspection report to the seller without the seller's prior written consent or as required by paragraph 5 of form 35, the inspection contingency shall be deemed waived. Okay.
So you don't want to screw up and make that mistake.
You do not want to screw up and make that. Very good, Scott. Correct. Okay.
So I had an interesting situation this last week that is kind of muddying all of this. We had an inspection, asked for additional inspections. Okay. Per that paragraph, the inspector wrote a recommendation. The way that he chose to write the recommendation was to say, recommend a plumber, recommend a roofer, recommend a crawl space, recommend electrician, recommend this, recommend that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The listing agent went unleashed. He felt like that was actually us waiving our inspection.
No, you're asking for additional inspections, correct?
Yes, and we used that box, and we used the recommendation letter from the inspector. The way that the inspector wrote it out, specifying who was going to be on the property: electrician, roofer, plumber, general contractor, all of these things.
Yeah.
The listing agent claimed that we had broken the Northwest MLS rules. So with negotiating and all of that kind of stuff, I hadn't sent it to him. The inspector had done that directly for whatever reason. I've used this guy for a long time. I don't know what made him think that that should happen, but no, that's actually not true. What happened was that piece was okay, but then one of the contractors, he wouldn't let us set up an appointment without the listing agent's written approval for them to come on the property to do the inspection. So the listing agent sent this guy a note saying, yes, it's been approved. When he sent the bid to me, he copied the listing agent on it.
The bid,
Yeah,
correct?
yep. So it wasn't this, sorry, it's early in the morning for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So anyway.
So, yeah, even though that's not an inspection, that's just a bid.
Yep. Yep. But he was very detailed in his bid. And so he was really upset that that got sent to him. So listing agents shouldn't be getting that stuff, number one. But one of the conversations that he'd had with me before was that he didn't feel like once these documents got changed, that there needed to be a recommendation attached anymore. He felt like it should just be that just the box checked was good enough.
Oh, box 3?
Yep.
No.
Yeah. Because it still very specifically states in there that its recommendation is attached.
It has to be, it does have to be attached.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, so I think we're definitely in the right, Susie.
Yeah.
You're definitely in the right. So
Well, the deal has continued to move forward. The seller didn't want to do the repairs that we had asked for, offered a $10,000 price reduction, which
Okay.
was kind of laughable because there was almost $70,000 worth of repairs that were the result of somebody having a faulty roof and they never took care of it. So now we had water behind siding and, yeah, the floors rotted out. I mean, it's a big deal. So anyway, they've decided to get their own bids this week, which is great because my client actually wants the house. They like the footprint, they like the neighborhood. So we're still working through it, but we'll definitely get more than $10,000 out of it.
Yeah, water does, out of everything in the property, water will do the most damage.
Yep.
To a house.
Yeah.
So, okay. Susie, thanks for sharing that. So, okay. Quick question, and these are just some questions, just FYI. So, like Susie was talking about, you can get additional inspections, time frame, 5-day additional if you didn't make any changes on the Form 35. When does that 5-day time frame start?
The day after it's been received.
The day after it's been received, correct. So if you have, let's say, a 10-day inspection contingency time frame, and you're at day 5, but you think you're going to need additional time, when would be the time to submit for the additional inspections?
So that depends on whether or not you want extra time or if you're in a hurry to close.
That's true.
Because because you legally can do all of those inspections within that 10-day period.
Correct.
Right. So if you can get your contractors out there, then you may not need that additional 10-day inspection or the additional 5 days.
5 days, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if for some reason you just remember, and this is the key point, is that once you serve notice for that additional time, additional inspections, day one starts the very next day. So if you serve it on day 3 of a 10-day inspection, you lose the additional 7 days.
Yep.
Okay. So if you have a 10-day inspection contingency period and you serve additional inspections on day 3 or day 4, that stops the 10-day time frame and it starts the 5-day time frame. So just keep that in mind when you're asking for additional inspection time frame. Okay. Are there any questions on section 1 of the inspection response form? Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the section 2. But before we do that, if the buyer, question for you guys, if the buyer requests additional inspections, how many days will they get? And when do those days initially start? I think we already talked about that. Per the contract, they get 5 days if they don't change anything, and it starts a day after they give notice.
So if you're having a hard time getting contractors out to the property, you might want to wait until day number 10 of the initial inspection period to serve notice that, we need to get an electrician out here or a roofer or whatever the case might be. And if you're truly looking for a little more time.
Correct. Yeah, because contractors sometimes are backed up, or inspectors are backed up. So you just need that extra time. Okay. In what scenario would the buyer send over the inspection report?
If it's requested by the seller.
If it's requested by the seller, or if you are asking for that additional time frame, you have to send over that portion that says the inspector recommends further inspections of plumbing, heating, whatever it may be. Okay.
Is that you always send it over automatically, the section?
Or if you're asking for additional inspections, additional time frame to do further inspections, yes, it's required because that's what the contract says. Okay, and you only send over that portion of the inspection report, that little paragraph that says inspector recommends further inspections of roof. Okay, just that little section.
So you can do that. I have found it just cleaner to ask the inspector to write a recommendation paragraph separate when he sends over the inspection report, so that I don't have to copy and paste. I could just attach the letter.
Correct. That's a great way to do it. Inspectors will do that for you. Okay. Thank you, Susie. All right. Let's take a look at section 2 of the inspection response. Section 2, this is where the seller has received the request for repairs, and the seller is now going to respond back to the buyer. The seller has 4 choices in this situation, in this section. Choice number 1, option number 1, seller agrees to all the modifications or repairs in the buyer's request. The inspection contingency is satisfied. The parties agree to proceed to closing as provided in the agreement, and the buyer's reply below is not necessary. So basically, the seller checks that box off, signs it. Seller's agreeing and saying, hey, Mr. Buyer, we'll take care of everything. Okay. Option number 2, the seller offers to correct only the following conditions described below or on the additional pages. So seller would check that box and they would say, okay, Mr. Buyer, you're asking for A, B, C, and D, but Mr. Buyer, here's what we're willing to do. We're willing to do items A, B, and D. Okay, that's where they would put that right there. They would check that box off and put that there. Okay. Third option is seller rejects all proposals by buyer. Seller checks it off and basically seller saying, I am not going to do anything. And then the last choice the seller has is seller rejects all proposals by the buyer, but proposes the following alternative modifications or repairs described below or on the attached pages. So let's say seller has something different in mind, the buyer's asking to get A, B, C, and D done, but the seller says, you know what, Mr. Buyer, we don't want to take care of this stuff. We are just going to give you a credit for $10,000 towards whatever, or we're just going to reduce the price by $10,000. This is where the seller would check that box off and put that proposal down right there and sign it. Okay. So that's the seller. Those are the 4 choices that the seller has to respond to the buyer's request. Okay. Question for you. If the seller rejects the proposal by the buyer, can the seller terminate the agreement because they don't want to do the work?
I don't believe so. They can just refuse to do the work.
It does not terminate the contract.
Correct. So just because the seller does not want to do the work and is refusing to do the work does not give him the right to terminate the agreement. Okay. All right. Any questions on section number 2 right here?
I have a question about maybe best practices.
Okay.
Since these timeframes and issues do not repeat, is it a good idea to call and visit with the listing agent? Say if I'm representing the buyer, we're requesting certain repairs or modifications, or in the email, maybe in writing, and just take their temperature. Here's what the buyer would like to ask for, rather than put down, we want you to do this, this, and this, and the seller says no. I don't know that there's a chance for the buyer to say, buyer proposes alternative, basically a counter offer. Once you get past this stage where the seller responds. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, that's just here the seller has a chance to say, no, I don't want to fix everything you mentioned. However, I will do this, and I'll pay an extra $2,000 towards your closing costs. So here's, in a sense, a counter offer from the seller. And I believe in the next section, the buyer doesn't get to counter offer the seller's counter offer when it comes to repairs and modifications.
That's true, Scott. However, you can email or you can call. My personal opinion is voice-to-voice communication is going to be your strongest negotiating tool. And just like you said, kind of get the temperature. Don't like upset the listing agent because it's not their decision, but just find out what's the logic here, what's the rationale here, and do some homework in advance to find out like whether or not the prices that you agreed to are still holding true based on what's going on in the market, that kind of thing. But again, if you've gotten some bids, you have much stronger space to negotiate from than if you're just kind of guessing, saying, well, we want a $50,000 price reduction because the fence is down and the roof looks awful, if it's not based on anything concrete, like a bid, you have a harder time negotiating. But voice-to-voice communication with the other side is always going to be your best option.
Yeah, actually, Susie, you hit it spot on. In here again, a lot of times I try to do the voice-to-voice, picking up the phone and making the call because it may save us a day or two, a day in negotiating, going back and forth just in writing. Here again, too, it also depends upon the listing agents, because sometimes there are listing agents where maybe sometimes it could be a little bit combative, and maybe you do want to keep it in writing on paper. But for the most part, I do want to do a reach out to the other agent and to the other broker and just have that conversation to see where they're at. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I always follow it up with an email, Scott, and just communicating back to saying, this is what I understood. What do you think about this language in an addenda that could be attached to this, and let them have some feedback on how the language is constructed, all of that kind of stuff. Because the bottom line is both the seller and the buyer, they're vested. They both have an interest in this thing closing. And so that's where, as agents representing our side, we have to put our whole thing on the side and just do our best to try to get it closed and leave our attitudes and personal ideas and offenses on the side.
Yep.
Thank you for all that. And so I was kind of after was best practices. So that was a great description. Thank you.
You are welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Susie. Okay. Let's take a look at section 3 now. This is the buyer's reply to the seller's response. So buyers made a request for repairs. The seller has responded. Now it's the buyer's turn to respond to the seller's response. So we've got 4 choices here. Let's take a look, or I'm sorry, we got 3 choices. Option number 1, buyer accepts the seller's response and agrees to proceed to closing as provided in this agreement. The buyer's basically saying, hey, Mr. Seller, we accept your proposal. Option number 2, the buyer rejects the seller's response. Buyer disapproves of the inspection and this agreement is terminated. The earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. So buyer saying, no way, we are not going for it. If you're not going to replace the roof and the siding, we are going to terminate the agreement. We get our earnest money back and we are moving on to the next property. Okay. Option number 3, buyer rejects the seller's response, but offers the attached alternative proposal for modification or repair. Buyer acknowledges that the inspection contingency will be waived unless the buyer and seller reach a written agreement, or buyer gives notice disapproving the inspection and terminating the agreement before the deadline in paragraph 6B of the inspection contingency, Northwest MLS 35.
I see this writing contradicts what my concern was in the previous section, but you still have that deadline. The seller has to respond. So there is an opportunity here for the buyer to say, hey, I don't like your response, Mr. or Mrs. Seller. How about this? And so if the seller just doesn't speak up and you don't terminate the agreement, you are waiving your inspection contingency by their no response.
So you're correct, Scott, in that inspection item that I was just talking about with my clients with the roof and the siding and all of these damages that have happened because of water leaks. Rather than rejecting the seller's response, we just simply responded within our time frame and sent an addenda asking for additional time, because after I talked to the listing agent, they agreed that it would be best for them to hire their own contractors to get their bids. So rather than saying we reject the seller's response, and now we're kind of in the timeline of Northwest MLS, we attached a 34 extending these deadlines and not responding with the deadlines by marking this box.
Good. So you just extended the time frame.
Yep, so that we didn't
Okay.
have to,
Awesome.
mark that we were rejecting the seller's response. We did a verbal over voice to voice with the listing agent, came to an understanding that they thought we were unreasonable, and we knew that they were definitely unreasonable, but they definitely want to be closing. So we extended all of this to give the seller the opportunity beyond his 3 days response. We gave him a full week to get contractors and get bids
Yeah.
and go from there.
Awesome.
This-
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. This option number 3 in section 3 is really important that you understand how this works, because once the seller sends over their response to the inspection, that starts the time frame. That starts the clock ticking on when the buyer needs to respond back. Okay. So typically, if the seller responds and goes back to the buyer, per the form 35, how many days does the buyer have to respond to this section right here? Does anyone
3.
know?
3.
3 days, correct. So the buyer needs to either respond back or come to another decision. Like the buyer, within that 3-day time frame, the buyer could go back to the seller and request repairs or request price reductions, whatever. They could do as much negotiating as they need to within that 3-day time frame and come to some sort of a resolution or agreement. If they can't, they would probably need to terminate. Otherwise, after that 3-day time frame, this contingency will be satisfied. Now that makes sense? Okay. Any questions on this section right here? All right, we may have a little test on some of this stuff. Let's move on. So question, if buyer and seller can't agree on the work repairs and the allowed timeframes of section 3, what are the buyer's options? Can the buyer terminate the contract and receive their earnest money back? Can the buyer do nothing and the inspection contingency will be satisfied? Or could the buyer continue to negotiate with the seller up to 3 days from receipt of the seller's response, or all of the above? What's the correct answer?
I'm gonna let somebody else answer.
I have a feeling you know this one, Susie, so let's.
Yeah,
see.
I'm not gonna answer this one. I'm gonna let somebody else.
It would be all of the above, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Who is
Sorry.
that, Pam?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
Pam.
Molly?
Okay.
If you said all of the above, you would be correct. So the buyer can terminate the agreement. They would get their earnest money back. If the buyer does nothing within section 3, that contingency will be satisfied. So if and here's one trap that sometimes agents fall into, newer agents sometimes, is that they're waiting around for the seller to respond, and the seller keeps telling them, well, we're getting estimates, we're getting bids, we're doing this, we're doing that. And they wait around and they go past that 3-day time frame waiting for the seller to respond. The seller will then come back and say, well, we've gone past the 3-day time frame, the inspection contingency is waived. So make sure that doesn't happen to you. You have 3 days in order to respond back, whether it's come to a mutual agreement or terminate. The buyer needs to do something within that 3-day time frame of the 35R. Okay,
My mom liked to say that silence is an answer.
silence is an answer, correct. Buyer can continue to negotiate with the seller up to 3 days from receipt of the seller's response. So yes, they can go back and forth as many times as they want within that 3-day time frame. All right, let's take a look next. Question, in section 3, if the seller and buyer cannot come to an agreement after 3 days, what happens to the inspection contingency? It is, I hear you guys thinking it is waived. It is satisfied. All right, I got a what do you think? What would you think type scenario here? In section 2, if the seller has agreed to make all the requested repairs, can the buyer ask for additional repairs if they're still within the inspection time frame? So let's say in section 1, the buyer does their inspection, they go to the seller and they say, Mr. Seller, we want you to fix items A, B, C, and D. And the seller says, yes, we will correct items A, B, C, and D. But the buyer is still within that 10-day time frame from section 1. Can the buyer go back and say, you know what, we also want you to fix, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Can the buyer request that additional repair work?
Absolutely, but the seller can also absolutely refuse.
Well, in the seller's response, when they agree to fix everything that was requested, isn't the additional language there, the buyer's inspection contingency is satisfied and they agreed to proceed towards closing? So that seems to put a stamp of finality on the subject.
Once the seller agrees to fix all the repair works, that then satisfies this inspection contingency. The buyer could actually ask for stuff. The seller doesn't have to the seller doesn't have to, is not obligated to do anything at that point. But also the buyer is not allowed to terminate as either after this inspection contingency is satisfied. So yeah, just making sure that the buyer is aware of that, even though they may have time frame, like negotiations go quickly. And even though the buyer is still within that 10-day time frame of section 1, if they've already came to an agreement with the seller regarding repairs, the buyer cannot come back around and say, well, I thought about it, or I forgot, I wanted the seller to repair, these items. We want to ask for that. The buyer can't do that after they've already agreed and waived their inspection contingency.
So one of the things to note with that too, is that for some cultures, renegotiating, even though it's already been signed, is a standard. So just don't be shocked if it happens where people are asking for more. I mean, you gave them an inch, so they're going to go for the whole mile now. So there's that cultural piece that just to be aware of. And I think the other thing that's worth noting is that the inspection was, the requests were made based on the condition of the home at that time. If in the meantime, we ended up with a storm and the tree came down and hit the garage and busted a window out, the seller is still responsible to repair that because the buyer has an expectation to be able to purchase what it was when he put in the offer.
Yes. Thank you, Susie. Any questions on this scenario?
I have a question.
Shoot.
It's about timeframes. I'm not seeing where it says timeframes. I heard that the time frame for a response was 3 days on section 3, but I didn't see that.
So some of that
Nope.
language, Don, is going to be in your 35, not in your 35R.
Correct.
Okay,
Those timeframes are laid out in correct, Susie, in your 35, in Form 35. Okay.
okay, thanks.
Plus your transaction coordinator here at the office, Kelsey, they will also remind you of those timeframes. So. Okay. All right, next question. In section 1 or section 3, if the buyer terminates the purchase and sale agreement, what other forms will you need to get signed to get their earnest money returned? Form 50. It's a release of earnest money. Even though the buyer terminates the contract, escrow will be looking for either a rescission or a release of earnest money. If you're terminating based off of the inspection contingency, you do not use a rescission because we're not rescinding the contract, but you use a release of earnest money. Okay.
Which
Question in
number is
section-
that, Steve? Do you know off the top of your head which number form that is?
Form number 50.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Question. So in section 2, the seller rejects all repair requests. In section 3, the buyer modifies the request and sends it to the seller. Can the seller terminate if they refuse to do the repairs? Can the seller terminate? Yes? No?
No,
Susie says no. Anyone say yes? The seller cannot terminate. No. The seller can refuse to do the repairs, but then it's on the buyer whether they want to continue and move forward or not. Okay.
so this just actually happened to me within the last month where a seller rejected all of the stuff. My client is considering using their time frame that they have, which is 3 days. We didn't respond immediately, and next thing we know, the listing's gone back active. So imagine what your buyer thinks when they see it pop up on their Redfin list, that the house that they're under contract on shows up as active again.
Yeah.
This
They
just-
cannot do that.
Well, they did. So
Yeah.
so what was unfortunate about that situation was my clients were actually leaning towards moving forward. That was their plan. But
Uh-huh.
they wanted to pray about it for another day. They saw this go active and they were like, we don't want to work with somebody in bad faith.
Mm,
So they canceled the contract.
that's unfortunate.
But where the agent already activated the listing again.
Yeah,
So
that's why,
you'll see a lot of funky, weird things that agents are doing.
yeah, we will, because there's, you have to have a good working knowledge of the contracts. And this is something where people could get really, they're confused about how the contracts work and the best way and I guess best business practice, or just the way the contracts work. I mean,
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think one of the things I would just encourage our newer agents on is just because you're new doesn't mean that you know less about the contract. Chances are you actually know more because you've learned it from the beginning. Agents that have been in the business for 20, 30 years, a lot of times are not as open to change, or their brain, for whatever reason, is accepting information a little bit differently. And so they will get really aggressive about their knowledge and kind of talking down to you and stuff. So look at the language, hold the course to defend and represent your client.
very true, very true. Thank you, Susie. Question: at any time in this inspection contingency, can the seller unilaterally terminate this agreement? No, they can't. Okay. All right, let's take a look at, good, we're doing good on time. Let's take a look at drafting language, repair language, okay? Drafting repair requests. These are just some tips for drafting when we're looking at, when we're asking the seller to do repairs. These are things to keep in mind. Number one, spell out exactly what you're asking for and requesting the seller to do. Be very clear about what you're asking for.
Can you give an example?
I sure will. And actually, give me we'll go through this and then we'll actually go through some examples.
Okay.
Okay. Be clear and concise with what you're asking. Third point, make sure to include professional tradespeople to make the repairs when you're requesting those repairs. So if you're requesting repairs and you have time, I think Susie and Scott touched on it, to get estimates and bids for the work. If you're requesting those repairs, include those in your requests. Okay. And do not leave any repair requests left open to interpretation. Here again, this leads into being very clear and asking, spelling stuff out, clear and concise. Okay.
And also saying when, Steve.
What's that?
Like, I think even just by saying, the time period also, like who's gonna do it, what they're gonna do, and when it's gonna be done, because I think.
Because sometimes that makes a difference.
Yeah. We've,
Yeah, and
I mean, I've seen, like, working with Yolanda, it hasn't happened to me yet, but working with Yolanda, I've seen a lot of things happen where it's like closings get, delayed or weren't delayed, and then suddenly, but something wasn't done yet. And so if you want us to do it anyway, I don't know.
yeah, and here's the thing, just kind of, this is kind of a best business practice. When we're talking about repair work, and let's say it's a big job, whether it's replacing the roof, replacing the siding, plumbing, whatever it may be, make sure you're staying very communicative with that agent as far as when the repairs are being done. Within the language of the contracts, it already talks about the timeframes and being completed prior to closing.
Yep.
So putting it right there in plain sight probably would, although redundant, it just puts it in front of their face, but it does state that it needs to be done prior to closing. But make sure that the seller is getting those items taken care of prior to closing, and making sure that they're staying on time frame, like knowing when start's going to happen, knowing when the completion date is. If you need to call the contractor about the work that's being done, feel free to call the contractor. Okay. So here's some, don't use words or phrases, or don't use phrases like this. Sellers should repair. Sellers should repair the dry rotted floor in the bathroom. Okay. Buyers would like the seller to complete the dry rot floor in the bathroom. Buyer would like the seller to replace the dry rotted floor. Okay. Do not use these words. Fix the toilet. What does that mean? That's how it came across in an inspection response.
I know the
Very-
answer. It means the toilet seat is loose.
That's exact. If you leave it up to the seller, fixing the toilet could mean turning the screw on the back end to tighten it up. Okay,
Or jiggling the little flusher thing.
that's right. Right. I fixed it. Right. So repair dry rot on deck. Be very clear and concise. Dry rot on deck, whereabouts, what parts of it? The seller will probably fix that one little board on the corner and replace it when the dry rot is fully underneath and spread out amongst the deck. So here again, do not be very clear on what your expectations are for of the work that needs to be done. Better
And who
yet,
will do it? Like, say seller, they'll be like, yeah, the buyer can come fix the deck. We'll let them.
yeah, right. But on something like this, repair dry rot or anything big like that, if you as a buyer can get a bid of the work that needs to be done, attach the bid and say that you want this company to do that, that is definitely acceptable when going back to the seller and requesting repairs, stating that I want ABC Construction to complete this work per attached bid, and attach the bid to the Form 35R. Okay. All right, so here's some examples, getting into writing some language. So this is the inspector report. The inspector cannot find evidence that the furnace has been serviced in several years. Recommend have the furnace serviced and inspected by a HVAC company. Okay, this is typical for an inspection report. I actually copy and pasted this off of an inspection report. Here is what a broker came back with: seller to fix furnace. I'm sorry, this is what the buyer wrote on their Form 35. Seller to fix furnace. Have no idea what they're talking about. How would you guys write that in there? Any ideas on how you would put this on your Form 35R?
Did these two comments go together in an exchange of requests?
Yeah, so this one by the inspector, this is on the inspection report.
Uh-huh.
Now the buyer's broker is requesting repairs, and this is what the buyer broker put on the Form 35R in section 1.
Yeah.
Seller to fix the furnace. Okay.
And that's badly done because the inspector's comments doesn't indicate something is wrong or not
Correct.
working correctly. It just looks like it hasn't been serviced in several years.
But also, Scott, it's like Steve was saying with the fix the toilet. It could be like putting a new
Filter in.
filter. That's the word. See, all my hand gestures, you could figure it out. Put the new filter
did.
get fixed,
Yes.
but that's not actually what the buyer needs. And so that's the thing that you always have to come back to. What is it that is the best representation for your client? Period.
Yes. Here is the next line right here under professional broker. This is typical language that I would write in there when I see something like that. Seller to have the furnace serviced by a licensed HVAC company and make all recommended and required repairs so that the furnace is in good working condition. Period. Very clear, concise.
You
I
forgot.
have
to say
something
it.
to interject here.
Go
In
ahead, Scott.
listening to Annie Fitzsimmons, who I love and enjoy and appreciate, that word to, seller to have furnace service. She was training us in her, how to draft like a lawyer, class. Don't ever use that word to. Put seller shall.
Shall.
So, I mean, you could say seller will, but Annie Fitzsimmons, seller shall have furnace service, and whatever you want to say, seller, we're going to do it.
So what is her issue with that preposition?
It's not, we're held to the same standard as if an attorney filled out these forms, and no attorney with good command of the English language, you use the word to. It's not even English.
Okay.
It's not proper grammar. So seller
Scott,
shall or seller will have furnace service makes a complete statement. Seller to have furnace service. That's not really a correct, phrase or statement in English that would hold up in front of a judge.
The fact that you brought that up, Scott, goes to the point of being clear and concise, because we do not want to leave this up to any sort of interpretation. Because one little word like that, even though I think that seller to have furnace service would be fine, but if you change the word to seller would like, that changes that whole statement up.
Buyer requests.
Or seller request or buyer requests, correct.
Yeah.
But the buyer requesting it does not create an actionable step in
Correct.
the same way that, and that's where I think the preposition to has become an adopted word in America. It is English here, and most of us don't speak like lawyer or legalese kind of thing. And so, but we pay a crap ton of money, so we better like heed what she says. I mean, draft like a lawyer. That's Scott's right. That we are held to that same kind of standard, even though our buyers and sellers are going to go, what? Can you like just write English?
Yeah.
Because to them, it doesn't sound or look like English. So yeah.
Seller will or seller shall, absolutely. Be very, very clear, concise.
I have one more thing to throw in there that I learned long ago. And I don't know if it's already in Form 35, but it's that the seller shall have whatever work performed at seller's expense prior to closing. So who pays for it? When does it get done?
I believe that is in the Form 35R, and then
That's already
it also,
included.
yeah, it's already included, and it goes into being done in a professional like manner. I forgot exactly how they.
Yeah, it's in the 35.
A commercially
Correct.
reasonable manner.
Yeah.
Manner. Yep.
And that never gets called on the carpet. I've seen that violated many times where it's a horrible repair job done by the homeowner instead of a contractor.
Correct. And
Yeah.
I think we're headed there soon, because we're going to be talking about some of these repairs. Like when we talk about fixing the dry rotted deck, make sure it's licensed and bonded work person who does that, and not the homeowner fixing the deck, because they're the weekend warrior type. And so yeah, just those are things to look for. Make sure you're clear on.
And I
So
think it's also just really important while you're negotiating with the other agent who's representing the seller, that you know that you know these things, right?
Yes.
So when you're saying that these things need to be done by a commercially responsible manner, that's also where one of the last things I always put in my 35R is that the seller is to provide the buyer with all the receipts for the requested work. And that just helps them to kind of take ownership of the fact that I know that you should know that this is required.
Yes, actually, good point, Susie. Because you're asking to get licensed bonded contractors. Make sure that you get those receipts. Put that in as a last piece on your 35R. Seller to supply buyer with receipts of work performed 2 days prior to closing. Okay, so here's another one. Let's take a look at this. This is what what's on the inspection report. There's there's rodent evidence seen as droppings, recommend contacting a licensed pest controller noted in the crawl space.
Huh.
Okay. So untrained broker, seller to treat for rodent activity and clean droppings in the crawl space. Sound fair enough? Maybe. This will be common, what we would see.
Mhm.
Can we make this better? And how would we? All right, let's take a look at what,
Seller will have a licensed pet controller, right?
go ahead, go licensed. Okay,
Huh?
let me put this back up here. So seller to
Yeah.
have home treated and serviced by licensed and bought in rodent remediation company to treat and remove active rodent activity and fix any and all conducive conditions that may lead to future activity.
I like that and.
Yes. So this is typical language that I would put if I saw this, that right there, rodent activity and droppings. We want to make sure that they're not just sweeping up rat poop and throwing some bait out there. We want to make sure that they're also fixing any conducive conditions that are leading up, like the vents that are allowing the rodents to enter into the property. We want them to treat, whether it's poison, get rid of the vermin. We want them to get rid of that, fix that problem.
You don't want a dead rat decomposing in your crawl space that still
No.
potentially can get in the air that you breathe inside your home.
Yeah, I had a story of someone in our office, and they had rats getting into their into the ducts, which died, and that put out a smell for a while. So yeah, you want to get those items fixed, and if there's ductwork broken, you want to get that sealed up. I mean,
Yeah.
any conducive conditions you want to get repaired. Okay, let's take a look at another one here. All right, inspector, the bath sink drain line is leaking. A licensed tradesperson should be called to make repairs. This was noted in the following areas: master bath, left sink. I know a great plumber that could fix that too. Okay, so professional broker, seller to have left sink drain line and master bathroom inspected and repaired by licensed and bonded plumber. Period. Okay. Take a look at
I have a
another-
comment, and
Yes.
your broker, designated broker kind of people like our friend Steve here might say, don't ever do this. But to me, if you ask for a licensed, bonded plumbing contractor, electrical contractor, whatever, you just narrowed the field and you added a lot of expense. So out of trying to be helpful, and I'll actually tell the other agent what I wrote and why I wrote it, that I would want a professional electrical tradesman to make repairs. And I don't put in the words licensed, bonded, and insured. And that allows the possibility for the homeowner, maybe one of his best friends is an electrician, and can come over, and for, you know, $50 and a half a rack of beer, we can take care of all. But you have someone who's professionally knowledgeable, who has a journeyman license, knows what they're doing, make the repairs. And so it's just something I've done. That might be a disapproved, not encouraged practice, but for the helping the seller pay for good quality repairs without spending a ton of money, you don't have to hire a licensed, bonded, insured electrical contractor. You can have a licensed professional electrical tradesman perform the work.
Ah, okay.
But
Does that fit the commercially responsible language?
that's not, it's commercially reasonable.
Right. Okay, so is
Yeah.
that's what I'm asking is, does it fit within that context?
So what it would be is if it ever got called on the carpet, and it pretty much never does, but if somebody were saying, hey, this isn't fixed in a professional manner, if an electrical inspector came, or somebody from an electrical contracting agency company goes, this is not done correctly, then that's not done in a commercially reasonable manner. So it's the
If-
standards of the community you're in and the rule books that they have to follow, whether it's plumbing or the roof or dry rot, whatever the subjects are.
You can actually go that route, Scott.
Yeah.
If you go that route, make sure you have that conversation with your client that this is this is what's happening. It is a commercially licensed
Mhm.
professional. But if you do that route and you're the buyer and you're accepting that,
Yeah,
I would also maybe throw in there that to get the re-inspection done, because the buyer is allowed to get the work re-inspected prior to closing, have that inspector who originally inspected go back out there and re-inspect it to
Yeah.
check the quality of the work.
yeah. I had that backfire on me years ago. I was representing the buyer and I put in, I'm a detail nerd. I put in the inspection request for repairs that all service work and repairs done to the furnace or duct work will be done by a HVAC professional. All electrical repairs will be done by an electrical professional person. And the lady called a handyman, really nice guy. And so when I called her out on that, I said, what part of this didn't you understand? She goes, well, what do you want? I hired a licensed contractor. Well, he doesn't know his butt from a hole in the ground about electricity or these, how to service a furnace. So he came out there. The first words out of his mouth, literally before hello, was, yeah, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. Well, it shows. And so my lifelong best friend is an electrician. I got my phone on speakerphone and I was making the repairs following his, okay, Scott, now pull that wire off and put your tester on here, and did that kind of stuff, and we made it right. So the GFI circuits in the kitchen worked right. And he had his 2 million-year-old dad come out because he was busy and put caulking around the bathtub shower, valves, and just looked like he did it behind the barn somewhere in, Oklahoma. It was just awful. Couldn't have been worse.
Yes.
That's one of the things, Steve and Scott, that I do some of the time, depending on the kind of temperature of what's going on with the contract.
Mhm.
If we've been in a home that's older and it's got good bones, but you can just see like people they tried, but they didn't really have any know-how, I will actually request that the work be done by a buyer approved contractor, and we'll attach their contact information with the bid to the request, because I don't want to leave it open for interpretation where somebody can have somebody else come in and do a barter system with them, and maybe they know and maybe they don't, because as representing the buyer, I want them to have the best product.
Right.
Yeah. And there is if you have someone like I'm talking about, maybe they're not financially responsible if something goes wrong.
Right.
Right.
They bought a defective part and it
Yeah.
wasn't their fault, but typically a contractor will come back and make repairs for free if they installed a defective part that was defective right from the factory, and they just eat it.
Yeah.
And somebody, the good friend down the street scenario might not work as well.
Right.
Yeah. Spot on. Thank you, guys. So, all right, last one. Ventilator functioning at time of inspection. Exhaust duct not connected to the upper cabinet. How would you address that? So here's some language, example language. Seller to have the licensed and bonded contractor connect exhaust vent located above kitchen stove range to vent to the exterior of home. Okay. Doesn't need to be an electrician, but this could be something a contractor does. But if there is a repair work and it's specific to the electric, or if it's specific to the plumber, like we were just talking about, make sure that it is an electrician or a plumber or an engineer or a rodent remediation company. Okay. All righty, gang. I will skip this one for time. And any questions? We're at the top of the hour. Any questions before we wrap up? No? All right. Well, we have, if you are not familiar, Washington Realtors has a YouTube channel. Annie Fitzsimmons puts on a lot of classes there that she records. Check it out if you want to dive deeper or get a different perspective than when I'm teaching. So I appreciate everyone coming in. Thank you. Don't forget, we're doing a Safeway Hawks Prairie fundraising. So if you have the opportunity, swing by, make a donation. And yeah, make a donation and we'll go from there. So have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome. We'll do this again next Friday, but hopefully I'll see you. Everyone's going to the Christmas party. So all right. On the count of 3, let's get a big be bold. 1, 2, 3. Be bold.
Be bold.
Woohoo!
Thanks, gang.
I love your hat, Don.
Thanks.
I know.
I'm bell ringing later, so I'm getting ready
Atta
already.
girl, you go. That's
I'll
awesome.
see you out there.
Okay.
Bye, you guys.
Thank
Happy
you, Steve.
weekend.
You're welcome.